Welcome to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. I am Giulia Bottaro and I am back from my holiday, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Heather Dinwoody and Felicia Jackson. As usual, we're going to discuss three main stories from the past week that caught our eye. I'm going to start. This week, my story comes from the US, and it's about the Securities and Exchange Commission putting on hold its climate disclosure rule. So this rule was approved in early March, and the idea was that it would require companies to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions. So this rule, for those that have been following, has been going on for a very long time. It was delayed several times. It was finally approved, but the final version didn't make anyone happy. The Republicans thought it was going too far, and the environmentalists thought it was not going far enough. Because, for example, there was an initial discussion of requiring companies to disclose on Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, and then it was later dropped. So really, companies would only have to report on Scope 1 and 2. And so, as I said, nobody was happy, which meant everyone sued. So both the Republicans and the environmentalists took the SEC to court to sort this out. And so in reaction to this, the agency decided to put the rule on hold. Now, what does this mean? I know that the initial reaction would be this is hindering progress on this need to ask companies to be more transparent. But actually, it's only a pause, and lawyers say that this could be a smart litigation move from the SEC because it will allow for faster proceedings in court. And I think my 2 cents on this is that ultimately this rule would have not been enforced until 2026. So really, for companies, it's not like companies were disclosing for the whole of March, and now as of April, they can't disclose again. Like, you know what I mean? They should still be preparing. They have 2 years, start thinking about their emissions, start thinking about systems to measure them, and so on. So yes, it's not ideal, but it doesn't mean that this rule will not be enforced in the future.
Well, I mean, but does it? Because to me, it sounds like, the official line is, well, we've pulled the rules so that companies don't have regulatory uncertainty, which sounds really, really sensible. But surely the rule itself has already been watered down from what was originally proposed. This is just, quite frankly, feels like more uncertainty, more confusion. The US is basically going, well, it's too complicated, so we're not going to enforce any form of disclosure on climate risk, while the rest of the world is moving forward. We've talked before about the fact that California, which is the world's 5th largest economy, has implemented its own rules. It's like, what good does it do to have this patchwork approach to standards and disclosure and understanding what's going on with companies?
I suppose to me, so you said the lawyers have made the argument that this period of extra time will allow for legal proceedings to move faster. But surely the success of that really depends on the SEC winning all of these legal cases.
Which have all got different points.
Exactly. And if these legal cases are being brought against the rule in its current form, then if they win, presumably that means that the rule will have to be changed. So if we're allowing time for these legal proceedings to go ahead quickly, that's great if we come out of it with the same rule that we had already and it can then be implemented and everything's fine. But we're also giving time for it to be weakened further, surely?
Well, or strengthened if the environmentalists
And
win.
how likely do we think it is that the legal cases against the SEC are going to result in a stronger climate disclosure
I'm
rule?
sorry if as ever I live in delusion, okay? Thank you.
Well, I mean, they are making arguments on both sides, so it could happen. It seems unlikely.
Well, did you see that March is the 10th? The reports have just come out about the temperature, and March 2024 was the 10th month in a row that broke climate records, and that scientists are kind of going, that's unnerving. We don't exactly know why it's quite as bad as it is, but things could be looking a bit concerning. Maybe the climate will fall apart and the SEC will go, oh yeah, we should probably report on climate risk.
You would
Okay.
think.
I'm sorry, I went off on a spiral there. I do apologise.
No, I mean, yes, I guess I was desperately trying to see the positive side, which is, as of yet, this rule is not changing, is not being...
It's not being removed.
It's not being cancelled. I don't know. Yes.
I think also on the positive side is, I mean, Felicia, you mentioned California, but then you've also got rules in the EU and the UK that are beginning to be enforced and are going to be enforced far before whenever the SEC gets its bleep together. But some of the companies that the SEC's rule will apply to will also come under these EU and UK and elsewhere in the world as well. I think Australia and China, yeah. So companies that operate in more than one country are going to be beginning to implement these things already. We need to remember that this is a legal ruling to say that you have to do something. That doesn't mean that you can't just do it of your own accord anyway.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And frankly, anyone who is interested in the continuity of their business, the survival of their business, will start doing this whether it's mandated or not.
Let's call it the sustainability of their
I was
business.
actually deliberately trying to avoid that because then it would all get confusing.
I know.
I'm just going to talk about
sorry.
survival. It sounds much more dramatic.
Well, I'm glad we managed to give this a positive spin, as positive as we could, really. And maybe we can move on to the next story. Felicia.
Sure. So the story I'm interested in this week is actually some research that's come out once again in the US, but about social media misinformation. Funnily enough, this time not around climate change specifically, but actually around meat and dairy. I'm fascinated by this because obviously methane is a huge issue. And to a certain extent, people understand that methane is a problem. They understand that, it's 80 times more damaging than CO2. But there's a lot of confusion about where it comes from and how it can be addressed. There's issues around oil and gas and the release of methane. And actually, I think the number is that methane is responsible for about 30% of the current rise in global temperatures. Now, the weird thing about it is it's got a much shorter lifetime in the atmosphere than CO2. It's about 12 years, and I think CO2 is at least 100 years. What makes it really, really interesting is this short lifetime and this big impact, because there's an argument to say that if we could address methane emissions, we could actually address short-term impacts. We could really do something different. But where it gets really challenging is trying to get people to agree or to understand that there are functional changes that can be made that can make a really big difference to what's going on. And so this analysis that's come out from the Changing Markets Foundation is actually looking at misinformation posts online, looking at what are the particular issues where these conversations are just wrong. They're misinformation, they're cod science. And weirdly, a lot of it's about attacking plant-based protein or even vegan diets. And, some people have vegan diets because for moral reasons. Some have them because they're gluten intolerant, whatever it might be. But so almost all of these areas are being attacked online. And it's almost as if that climate misinformation has now become meat and dairy misinformation. So the idea of any change that could actually have a positive impact on methane emissions through meat and dairy is being attacked. One of the things that was absolutely fascinating to me was that over half of the posts they looked at, and when I say the post they looked at, I think it was just under 950,000 posts. Over half of that came from 50 accounts. So the level of disinformation coming from this really concentrated group is utterly fascinating to me. Because how do you...
Could you maybe specify kind of, who is this group? And
so the group of 50 or the Changing Markets Foundation?
The group of 50.
I don't know. What the analysis said was that it comes from 50 accounts. So you could call them, we've got influencers. The report calls them misinfluencers. But, some of them are right-wing media. Some of them are political figures. I haven't actually seen a list of who they actually are. But I think what's particularly interesting to me about this is that if you look at what's been happening politically recently, look at what's been happening in France in terms of the farmers who are trying to, to strike or to argue against changes in taxation laws. They've got a valid reason to be angry because they're looking at the removal of subsidies. But what I'm talking about is this wider movement to discredit changes in the way in which we address industrial agriculture. And that to me is a particularly interesting thing because meat and dairy is almost this, it's a carbon bomb that hasn't been addressed. Now, obviously I was talking about methane, but when you're talking about greenhouse gases, you're talking about impact. And to me, it's this unaddressed impact. I think there was some research I saw last year which showed that a shift, not full time, but a shift away from as much meat eating as we do could cut a third of emissions. If you cut out meat, if you cut it down to once or twice a week, you could actually change the emissions profile of meat and dairy cut it by a third. And I'm just fascinated by it because you've got all these big financiers investing in business as usual, industrial meat and dairy. And there's all these arguments that show that it's not good. You look at the meat and dairy industry, it's not good for the animals. It's not good for levels of nutrition. It's not good in terms of land use, and it's not good in terms of methane emissions. So I suppose I'm just fascinated by the fact that we've got to this stage now where instead of being able to attack information about climate change and climate science per se, because people have a better understanding of how things work, what you're now seeing is attacks on specific issues, specific attempts to change industrial patterns. And as I said, I find it utterly fascinating.
I find this really interesting because in many ways it's not particularly new, this idea of misinformation. I'm thinking of, dairy lobbying is quite infamous really for promoting the dairy industry above all else. But I haven't really heard this argument about, I've heard of sort of promoting meat and dairy in a way that might be deemed misinformation, but less so about this attack on plant-based alternatives and potentially other options.
That's only one of the things they're attacking. But this whole thing, it's influence, or as the report calls them, misinfluencers, which is very much talking about that there's one account which talks specifically about the politics of it all. And, it's like no farmers, no food. It's warning that this is all this discussion about climate impact is an attempt to attack farmers and, that farmer discontent, farmer issues with a lot of modern policies. It's all about climate and net zero. The problem is that the way in which these industries are structured are not good for farmers. A lot of the support that you get for farming, certainly in the UK, is most effective for large-scale industrial farming, not this idea that we have in our heads that this is small local farmers trying to make a living. There's just, like I said, there's just a lot of misinformation out there.
I've just brought up a piece I wrote last year about some research by the FAIR initiative, which found that 20 of the leading livestock producers were expected to fall into net operational loss by 2030 due to the rising costs of climate change. And that was both in terms of litigation and sort of the physical risks. And it said, investors' returns could take a hit of 7 to 10% before the end of the decade. So that I think that really shows that it's not good for farmers, the current system. It's also not good for investors in agriculture.
But what I would say about the investment side of things, and this is another really interesting area, there was some research that came out last week or the week before about US banks and the money they provide to the meat and dairy industry. It's slightly more widespread. They call it agri-commodity, but that's industrialized farming. And I think it's between 2016 and 2023, only 58, but US banks provided 134 billion in lending and underwriting, but they're lending that business as usual. And it's massively outsized in terms of its impact. So I think out of those 58 banks, the size of the portfolio was 0.25%. But in terms of overall financed emissions, it's 11%. So what you're actually saying is it's not, as you say, it's not just that it's the farmers at risk, it's the investment system. Because if you are putting that kind of money into something negative, you've got serious problems.
I think that, we're just getting banks to decide not to underwrite new oil and gas exploration. It feels we're decades away from banks not underwriting meat and dairy companies because, as we mentioned before, there is not enough awareness of the damage that is being done. We all think that the cows are happy and running on the hills, but that's not the reality. I think most of people do because ultimately
Giulia, we're going to go back to
you
you being overly positive.
No, but it's also in the marketing. How is cheese and milk marketed? There is a picture of a happy cow.
Bone health, that's the big one. It's all about calcium, and there's very conflicting research on that, but that's another podcast.
Yeah, I think we're going on many tangents here. And so as interesting as this conversation is, before we move on more tangents, perhaps, Heather, we can conclude with your story.
Alrighty, so I've actually got a really nice positive story to share, and we're kind of sticking with the theme of agriculture actually. So what caught my eye was a piece about a new vaccine for honeybees that has been conditionally licensed by the US Department of Agriculture. So this was developed by a company called, I think it's Delan Animal Health. That's how I'm going to pronounce it. I may be wrong. And it specifically targets a disease called American foul brood, which affects honeybee larvae, but it can destroy a whole colony within 3 weeks. And just a little background on the importance of bees, which Felicia and Giulia know is a bit of a passionate topic of mine. So bees assist with the pollination of at least 90% of the world's most important crop types. So this is things like the nuts and fruits and vegetables and everything that we rely on for a lot of our vitamins and nutrition. And without bees, estimates have suggested that agricultural crop production could decrease by as much as 8%, which might not sound terrible, but that doesn't reflect the kind of the switch that would need to take place from these really nutritious crops to other less important / valuable items. And already estimates suggest that there's about 427,000 premature deaths every year due to diseases that can spread without sufficient nutrition. And that's not just the amount of food, that's the quality, the vitamins and nutrients. And so that's kind of a really high cost to human health and well-being. But there's also the economic costs, because if you think about all of the agricultural trade that takes place and raw materials as well that rely on bee pollination, I've seen various different estimates as to how much bees really contribute to the global economy. The sort of settled on figure I've seen most often was $577 billion every year. So this is what happens when we lose the bees. And one of the solutions, and there are many that are coming up, I've seen tech-enabled beehives that monitor bee health, I've seen bee-friendly insecticide. But this new one is something that I hadn't come across before, and it's basically a vaccine that is given to the colony's queen, and using a concept called transgenerational immune priming, which basically means that the queen is protected from American foul brood disease, and her protection passes on to the rest of the colony. And what's interesting about it is that it doesn't use any chemicals. It's an organic vaccine, and it can be produced really sustainably. So that is now available in the US and Canada. So people can either purchase inoculated queen bees, which can then sort of pass this protection on to their hives. When I say people, I'm talking beekeepers.
Not just randoms.
You could if you wanted, I presume.
I like bees, but I don't necessarily want one at home.
Exactly. And then for larger operations, they are now selling vials of this vaccine as well, so you can inoculate all your own queens. And the company, Dallin Animal Health, they're really sort of taking steps to partner with regulatory bodies, agricultural organizations, and environmental groups to see how we can take a really holistic approach to protecting bees. So they're not only trying to further their own solution, although of course they are currently trying to scale up production, but they're also saying how can they work with regulators to ensure that it's allowed in other jurisdictions, or how can they support agricultural organizations in other solutions, such as, bee-friendly insecticides or whatever it may be. And I just thought this was a really nice, positive story about people working together to save the bees and thereby save all of us.
No, I love it. I think the idea of having any concrete interventions that support the bees is amazing. I will say, I think it's very important to point out that it's the 90% of the world's plants depend on pollination, not necessarily
Insect
just
pollination.
bees.
Yes, so the bees are contributing
Weirdly,
to that.
it's wasps as well. I don't know about you, but I was always taught that wasps are useless for nothing and just to be afraid of when you're little.
No animal is useless.
But that's my point. I was taught that when I was little, to be afraid of wasps and there's no point to them, but actually they pollinate as well. But I think it's also really useful to think about the specifics in terms of the economic impact, because you were talking about, what was that, 557 billion?
577 billion.
Numbers were never my thing, but that's a huge amount. But when it's global, sometimes it's hard to take it specifically. But I remember looking at an amount which looked at the contribution of bees and bees alone to the UK economy. And I think it was 690 million a year. We're a very small country. That is a lot of money.
It is incredible. And, even when, yes, we accept that there are other insects that pollinate, there's butterflies, wasps, whatever it may be, there's also plenty of other species of bees. This does specifically focus on honeybees. But we've now got this approach. We've now got a spark of an idea. And that's all that's really needed to then go on and develop products for these butterflies and wasps and other bees and whatever they may be. I think to me, this is about, it's a real innovation, I think. And from innovation, you then get the scale, you then get the much bigger impact later down the line. At the moment, it's basically like they've unlocked a door and said, hey, look, we can vaccinate insects. And from there comes so much more. You could even, vaccinate
really
crops
like
for
that.
all I care. Just vaccinate everything.
I really like that this is not only an innovation that opens the door, but it's also being already addressed in a holistic perspective. As you said, Heather, the governments are looking at this because so many times there are new discoveries that sort of stay in a lab or are celebrated, but they're not commercialized or scaled up. Well, this one seems to be really championed in this way. And I think that is very important because we can't just have solutions sitting on a shelf and waiting to be used.
Well, it's that thing about being prepared for change, because I think certainly in the EU, do you remember all the debate around, is it nicotinoids?
Yes.
Which are the fertilizers, I think they are.
I think they're insecticides.
Insecticides, but basically they kill everything. They kill all the pollinators. And this has been well known for a long time, and there have been debates about stopping it. I know in the UK their use is allowed this year. It's really hard to change things that people are used to, the way things work. So the idea that there's this possible change of the way in which we deal with challenges is incredibly exciting.
I mean, the thing you're mentioning there in the UK, so basically these nicotinoid, however you say it, they're technically banned, but every year they sort of review it and say, okay, well, do we really, really need them this year? And unfortunately, I think that's happened the past 3 years in a row, pretty much ever since this ban came in. Every year they've been like, oh, but we really need them this year. We really don't have another option. And that's where we need that spark of entrepreneurship and innovation, because you're right. Otherwise, solutions get developed and then they sit on a shelf because people don't know how to talk about them or how to market them effectively. And I think that is a really important point about this story, is that it's everything coming together. It's not just a great idea, it's also the commercialization, it's also the regulation. And that is what's going to drive us forward, because it's all very well regulating against harmful things. But if we're talking about insecticides or something, then yes, you need other options, because otherwise you get to the same point next year and they go, oh, but this year we really need it.
Well, and I think that's a really important point to conclude our conversation on and move to our interview of the week. I am here with Harry Marshall, co-founder at Open Atlas, and today we're going to talk about the EU Deforestation Regulation. Thank you so much, Harry, for being here with us today.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Would you like to start by giving us a little bit an overview about what you do at Open Atlas before we delve into the legislation talk?
Yeah, certainly. I think that would be a good start. So I am one of the co-founders at Open Atlas. We're a small Amsterdam-based remote sensing company. We came into being around about 12 months ago, and we were born out of the challenge or the forthcoming challenge of the EUDR, that being the European Union Deforestation Regulation, and the challenges that would have on companies with respect to verifying their plots of land within their supply chain, their producers, for deforestation risk. So I'm at a company our size. There's only 5 of us at this stage. You can imagine we all do everything. But if we need to put titles next to ourselves, I'm on the CEO side. I handle a lot of the commercial business aspects of what we do. And we've got a lot of very other smart people on board who handle the more technical sides of things and everything else that is entailed with a business like ours.
Amazing. Sounds like a really exciting project. So talking about the legislation then, can you give us an overview of what it is, what the purpose is, and of course how it will impact companies in the EU, but also outside of the EU? I know it's a big question, so.
Yeah, it's a big question, and I think we could talk all day about it and really only scratch the surface. So I'll try and give you as much of the high level as I can, and the rest of the listeners as well. But the European Deforestation Regulation came into law in July last year, but it has an enforcement date at the end of this year. So there's a bit of a window where companies can become compliant. And what does becoming compliant with this regulation entail? It entails essentially proving that your upstream suppliers and their primary producers haven't contributed to deforestation since what the EU considers the cutoff date, that being the 31st of December 2020. Now, the EUDR is a regulation that I think people try and boil it down to just saying it's just about deforestation. It's about mitigating the effects of deforestation globally, but also de-risking the European Union, its businesses, its consumers from deforestation. And I think anyone with eyes and ears has the ability to understand that deforestation is quite a pertinent problem around the world at the moment. Every year we're bombarded with quite disappointing facts around the levels of deforestation that have occurred in the last 12 months, in the previous years. And unfortunately, that is having quite an effect with respect to climate change and everything else associated there. A fact that stands out to me, which is quite startling as well, is that since 1990, forest areas around the world, roughly the size of the European Union, which is quite ironic, have been lost to deforestation. And if we can think about the critical role that forests and complex ecosystems like that have in fighting back against what is the upswell of climate change, CO2 gases in our atmosphere, etc., then this is really quite a blow to our efforts globally, regionally, I think across everything to try and mitigate the effects of climate change in a timely manner. The regulation itself, I think, which is also interesting, was born not out of some backroom bureaucrats coming up with the idea, but it actually was the result of hundreds of thousands of public submissions from EU businesses and individuals within the EU requesting that the EU Commission take some action around deforestation. Because the private sector, being the voluntary certification bodies and etc., they didn't seem to be doing a good enough job at mitigating this risk and controlling for that. So the EU passed this regulation last year that essentially mandates that all imported in-scope commodities and their derived products must perform additional due diligence when landing goods in the European market, but also trading in these goods. Now, these commodities refer to beef, timber, coffee, cacao, soy, palm oil, and rubber. And it's not just the raw commodities, but it's also a lot of their derived products as well. And we could go into the detail around what that is, but at a high level, you can understand that this regulation, as I think of it, it's very general because it says, hey, if you're dealing in these things, you need to perform this due diligence. But it's also incredibly specific because it's kind of ring fencing huge amounts of imports, plus 80 billion euros worth of raw value of imports into the EU every single year, and saying, if you touch any of these commodities or their derived products, you need to perform additional due diligence, which is where we try and step in. I think what our organization does is one very small link of a much bigger chain that's required to become compliant with this and prove that deforestation isn't occurring at the source. Now, we can go into it, but I mean, unless the listeners have all the time in the world to sit around and listen, I don't think it's effective. But I mean, the last side of this that I want to note, just with respect to the regulation broadly, is that, of course, the carrot of this regulation is that, if we do it correctly, if it's implemented correctly, we stand to reduce global deforestation, which is a fantastic carrot to wave around. But the EU understands that businesses respond to sticks as much as they respond to carrots, if not better. So there's quite heavy fines associated with non-compliance. So if businesses are found importing from plots of land that have contributed to deforestation, the penalties range from blocking EU market access in the future, confiscating goods, all the way up to fines up to 4% of their EU revenue. So I think it's fair to say that businesses are scared, and that fear is instigating a fair bit of change in how they operate as well.
So in practice, how can companies comply with this regulation? Because it seems quite challenging to figure out whether the cocoa or soy that you're buying from your supplier contributed to the cutting of trees.
Yeah, I mean, let me tell you, it is not an easy task. And I think a lot of businesses are just starting to implement the changes now. If they're lucky, they're doing it now. If they're unlucky, they're doing it in 6 months' time. But there are three components that are necessary, I think, to become compliant with this regulation and to have a positive impact, more broadly. That's, of course, what is crucial. A lot of people don't understand this about the regulation. They think it's all geospatial, satellite monitoring and all this business. But I think what is crucial is actually traceability from the end good all the way back to the primary producer. So the EU is quite specific in the regulation around this. It means you need to find out where your bag of coffee comes from, where the rubber in your tires come from, where the wood pulp in your IKEA table comes from. You need to find out where the source of that is, down to the plot level, which is, it's instigating a rapid advance of traceability within many industries. And I think that is a huge challenge. So once you have the ability to trace it back to the source, you need to acquire what we call polygon data. These are latitudes, longitudes, essentially shape files that indicate on a map where did this come from? And then once we have that data, we can verify it remotely using the solution that we have, where we take that land data, I suppose, the polygons, we measure that against satellite data over time from the cutoff date up until today. many, many times whenever a satellite goes across, and we crunch all of this through a very sophisticated machine learning algorithm. And that algorithm will indicate whether or not, if there was a forest there in 2020, is it still a forest? Or rather, is this green canopy, has that changed from a green canopy of a forest to a green canopy of a coffee plantation? So it's a very sophisticated way to do it. It's very complicated, but I'm just thankful that I think the technology is there where we can begin to do this, despite the challenges that it's having for many businesses.
It really seems that this legislation has much more to it than it initially appears.
Yeah, I think that is an understatement. I feel like how I've come to realize that the EUDR operates is, well, let's boil it back. I think the EUDR is cool for one reason above all else. And I think for the most part, stopping deforestation is a more or less non-partisan topic. Whereas a lot of other environmental discussions, whether or not you're a left-wing university campus Marxist or a Davos foreign multimillionaire, I think that you can have very different opinions on how something should be done with regards to environmental policy or sustainability policy. What's quite cool about this deforestation regulation is everyone loves trees. Doesn't matter who you talk to on the on the political spectrum, they want to save more trees. So I think at its core, if that is the goal of what we're trying to achieve, and if we take away all of these parts around how it interplays into a much more complex environmental landscape, climate change, etc., I think if we just distill that, people are behind this regulation. Everyone wants to support it. Why then is it perhaps a little bit complicated? And I think the best way to think about this is across this ESG, these three different pillars of ESG and how it impacts each of them. From an environmental standpoint, I think it's pretty clear. If we have less demand in the global economy for deforestation-linked goods and more demand for deforestation-free goods, that will have a net positive effect on deforestation globally. Now, someone can say that the deforested goods will just flow to countries that haven't got these regulations. I think that's certainly going to be the case in the short term. But if we look at the macroeconomics of it, there will be an effect on the demand for deforestation-free goods, which is going to impact deforestation globally the way over. And I'm already having these conversations with traders today that are saying that those effects are being felt already across these different commodities.
Yeah, and sorry, if I can interject, I feel that happens with a lot of other EU regulation because they really reverberate across the supply chain. So if you're demanding, for example, green steel in Europe, then the producers of green steel in Europe will demand green materials from their suppliers in Asia or Africa or the rest of the world. So I think it's really powerful the way that these regulations in one jurisdiction can impact the entire value chain. So I think it's really impressive.
I mean, completely. And the reality is it's already being shown. So the UK has now passed a slightly more watered down deforestation legislation. There's talk in the United States for a similar affected one. The EU is often, I've got lots of European friends. I'm not a European by birth, but I do live here. But I think they like to acknowledge the reality is that they are leading the way. And to lead the way often comes with, but to lead the way comes with, having to fight through the scrub a lot to get there as well. And I think this regulation at some level is fighting through the scrub. There's a lot of weeds that need to be navigated so it's implemented effectively. But they're definitely doing that. And I think other countries are starting to follow their lead as well. Now, where does this become controversial? So on the face of it, the EUDR is something I think a lot of people can get behind. But the underbelly of the EUDR is actually becoming compliant. So there are hundreds of thousands, if not definitely millions of smallholder farmers across the world that contribute to a value chain that ends up with European consumers having rubber for their tires, having coffee in their cups, having chocolate in their chocolate bars, all of these things. And the process for becoming compliant, unfortunately, is not an easy one. I was explaining a bit to do with the traceability, but also the geo-verification, which is what we do. None of these things are free, unfortunately, at this stage. Now, different actors within the supply chain can obviously afford to implement different compliance initiatives at a faster speed, more effectively, etc., and so forth. But at the end of the day, when we're talking about millions of smallholder farmers who, they cultivate crops on less than a hectare of land, they don't quite, unfortunately, have the capabilities to easily and quickly verify their plots of land to be deforestation free, nor can they easily implement traceability. So one of the underbellies of the regulation is that there is a huge risk that a lot of smallholder producers around the world will experience limited access to the European market as a result of this regulation. And on the converse side of that, a lot of large producers, so much larger plantations, not smallholders, they can much more easily and effectively, and comparatively cheaper as well, they can find compliance and they can continue to import into the European Union. So the effect here is one that no one wants, which is that there will be a lot of centralization around these commodities and in how they're imported, but also the commodities that contribute to these derived products that end up in the EU. And at the end of the day, smallholders who are, in a lot of senses, already experiencing the worst sides of climate change will also be hit with these kind of somewhat unfair implications. And I mean, we use satellite, so I'll come into what we do explicitly with the technology later, but I spend a lot of my time looking at satellite imagery today and looking at forests and plantations. And I can tell you what, whenever I look at satellite imagery over the EU, there isn't a lot of forest in the EU, unfortunately, because I think 100 years ago, 200 years ago, Europeans cut a lot of it down. So there is something to be said around the hypocrisy, I suppose, of saying you can't develop more by deforestation despite we have already. Now, this is a challenge with a lot of environmental regulations around the world. The kind of do as I say, not as I've done approach. But it's definitely something that's on the mind of a lot of people as well. Do you understand what I mean by that, Giulia? It's much more complicated when you look at the implementation than it is when you look at it at a high level.
Yeah, I was familiar with the challenges for smallholder farmers, but I didn't know the last part about the fact that Europe is very deforested ultimately. So, would this apply to, I would imagine if you're a company that sources materials from within the EU, it still applies to you whether it's been deforested or not. It's not just deforestation outside the EU, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. It is also if commodities are sourced within the EU.
Yeah.
But as is the case with a lot of these in-scope commodities, the European Union, the geography is it's a beautiful place, but it's not a fantastic place to grow rubber, coffee, or cacao.
No, 100%.
So for the large part, that's done elsewhere. But no, look, beef, a lot of European beef comes from within the EU, and that is all subject to the EUDR as well. So they're not saying everyone else do it differently, but I think they have got a couple 100-year head start on cutting down their trees.
No, that's absolutely true. So this would have been the S of the ESG. So moving on to the G of the ESG, what are the implications here?
Yeah, I'll try and speed run this one for us. In the conversations that I've had with businesses of all different shapes and sizes, there is a risk appetite, like any compliance, there's a risk appetite that companies are willing to engage with. Now, traceability down to the source is incredibly difficult to do. It's incredibly difficult to implement. And there is always some risk that it's not 100% effective. Now, you can mitigate those type of approaches with very comprehensive traceability and compliance solutions, tools, practices, etc. But there's already a spectrum that I've realized, which is people who are just scrambling to do just enough for the regulation and then people who are already trying to do above and beyond for the regulation. So I'm already recognizing that there's implications in terms of the different governance structures of different types of organizations around what is their attitude towards the EUDR. How much do they want to do? Do they want to do enough to just get by, which, you know, they need to find a way to do, or are they trying to do it absolutely 100% by the book? Now, it's not a pleasant thing to talk about when it comes with compliance, because everyone needs to do a bare minimum, and we want that bare minimum to be as high as possible. But we do need to acknowledge that the changes that need to be made to supply chains, to procurement processes, to traceability, to everything, they need to happen before the end of this year. And I've worked in large organizations before. They move at glacial paces, which is to say not very quickly. So I can understand businesses that are taking both of these approaches, where they're either trying to move fast and have something, or they're trying to move slowly and have something very good. But there is decisions to be made from a governance point of view around how organizations are structured and what their attitudes are towards deforestation and this regulation that impact how effectively they want to find compliance with it as well.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a huge challenge. So what businesses will this apply to initially? Is it like other types of legislations where it's sort of staggered, larger companies first and then medium and then small, or is it just everyone?
Yeah, so it does start with the larger businesses first, with a certain revenue over a certain amount or a certain headcount. So the enforcement date for them is the end of this year or the start of next year. And then I believe it's 6 or 12 months later, it opens up to all of the other medium and small size businesses as well.
Okay, it's pretty fast.
The EUDR, on one hand, yeah, it is. It's incredibly fast. Considering that it was passed in June last year, an 18-month enforcement window is signaling that they want to move quickly and that they're taking this very seriously. But if you're on the business side, it's not giving you a lot of time to comply.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would be frightened. In fact, I am quite frightened when I talk to some businesses. I go, gosh, it makes me wonder if I should be stockpiling coffee for next year or something like this.
I mean, possibly. You know, there are companies developing cocoa-free chocolate and all of that. So I suppose we're also moving towards that direction. But thank you so much, Harry. Is there anything else you would like to add on this topic? I know we could talk about this for days, but our time is almost up.
No, I think we've covered a huge amount of ground. There is infinite amount of detail to go into. I actually look at the EUDR and I see it as quite a positive trend line. Businesses are going to have to sprint to a certain milestone at the end of this year. And I have the feeling that sprint will keep them in momentum to keep making positive change into the future as well. And it's pushing a lot of money into traceability solutions, really making them more accessible. Also solutions like ours being geospatial, remote sensing, so verifying plots of land for deforestation. These are all becoming much more available, which is nothing but a good thing, I think, for the market on the whole. And hopefully we can realize some of the positive externalities associated with the regulation, not just the negative ones.
Definitely. I mean, the regulation is here to bring some good into the world. So something to watch. Thank you so much, Harry. For our listeners, we will sharing Open Atlas details in the show notes. And don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter and social media channels. See you next week.